Hello everyone, welcome to another update video. Uh, there's not really anything different to see here. As you can see, I've zoomed the camera out, but we still have our fleas. I know you like a good box of fleas, so set up an obstacle course for your viewing entertainment, you're welcome. But you're not going to see anything you haven't seen before in this video, but that's kind of the point, because even though it looks the same, there's actually been a very big structural change behind the scenes. All of the previous demos and things that I've showed off have been made with Game Maker, but this isn't. It's just made by me. Um, it seems a little bit much to call it an engine, but I suppose that's what it is. It's built using SDL and OpenGL. So SDL handles some of the more unenjoyable parts of getting a game up and running, like getting a window open, getting keyboard input, that kind of stuff. I'm using it for that, and I'm also using it to import images into the project as well. So that stuff's there and being utilized. But for the most part, this is just me working with OpenGL and interacting with OpenGL in the way that a real engine would. Basically, if you're not sure what that means, OpenGL is one of the ways that you can talk to a graphics card, is the way to think about it. So I have to set up all of the data and then tell it how to use that data, which takes a little bit of work to get it up and running, especially to get it to a point like this. You know, even just getting something up on screen can take a little while at first, but getting it to a point like this takes even longer again. But here it is. It's rendering and it seems to be doing okay. This video is just going to be me talking over this and explaining what's here, what's implemented and what isn't at the moment, and going into a little bit of detail wherever I can. Obviously, the biggest thing, first of all, is just rendering, getting stuff up on screen. I think I talked a little bit about this on stream at some point. I didn't really go into detail because I didn't know that this was an adventure I was about to embark upon. But I said that one of the things that Game Maker does, which I didn't know if I would be able to do myself, because it seemed like a hassle and something that I wasn't sure that I fully understood, was making sure that all of the sprites are kind of bundled together in an intelligent way so that the draw calls on the GPU are minimized. You basically want to minimize the amount of times you have to change what you're telling the GPU to do. And in order to do that, one big way of doing that is to make sure that you bundle your textures together, especially in a sprite-based game like this where we could get many sprites onto one texture page. That's what Game Maker calls them. I don't know if that's the regular nomenclature, but a texture page is what it's called, so that's what I'm calling it myself. If I can explain this right, all the fleas are doing right now is they have three states. They do a jump anticipation, a jump, and a jump recovery, right? There's about 4 frames for each one. So let's say they have about 12 frames of animation total. Well, we definitely don't want to store all of those 12 frames of animation as separate textures and then have to tell the GPU constantly that we're using a different texture each time. Instead, what you need to do is kind of get as many of them together as you can on one texture and then draw them all at the same time, but just use different texture coordinates when each flea is drawn, right? This minimizes the amount of time, amount of times you have to talk to the GPU, basically. And it allows the GPU to just crunch through stuff, which is what it's good at, right? So, the way this works right now is what you're seeing on screen, all the stuff that I'm going to talk about is I have tried to take as few shortcuts as possible. I'm trying not to be deceptive about what's implemented or what isn't. It's not like I've gone and hard-coded all of the UV coordinates for all of these things. A lot of the state machine stuff does have to be typed in by hand, basically, and all that right now. You know, I'll push that out to a file at some point, hopefully. But all of this stuff is generated when the texture is loaded, right? So all of these things just sit in a folder as individual sprites. And then when the game boots up, we build up the texture page and all of the correct UV coordinates for everything in order to draw the proper frames of animation when the time comes to show them. So that's all done correctly, and I think that's probably the most important thing to get right, especially for a 2D game. Probably I don't have experience with 3D, but especially for a 2D game, it seems like an important optimization technique to be using all the time. So we're using it. Another important thing to get right from the outset, you know, It's not good to worry about optimization too much when you're starting out, but for a thing like this with rendering, you definitely want to get at least some of it right in the beginning, right? So that the texture thing was an important thing. And another important thing is just how we store and manipulate the vertex information that the GPU needs to have access to. And all of that is tightly packed together in my current approach, right? So all of it is just in a bulk, which means that the computer can run through it without trying to look it up constantly in many different places. And that's an important thing to do as well. So all of that is tightly packed information that we can send off to the GPU in one batch, right? So those are the important things to have gotten right. And I think that's what makes this a real thing that approaches an engine, right? But I should mention that this is strictly 2D. There is no 3D support in here at all. I made a decision from the outset to keep it to 2D, and that's what I've done. So there's no 3D support at all, and I can't say what the level of difficulty would be to go and do a 3D engine instead. What I can say is I reckon it's probably a little bit more complicated than just tacking on a Z coordinate for a bunch of stuff, right? Because one of the very nice things about making a 2D engine is you know that you're going to want to represent basically everything with a rectangle, right? Anything that you want to show on screen is just a sprite. A sprite is just a rectangle, which means that it's just two triangles next to each other. If you picture two triangles pushed next to each other, you can make a square with them, or you can stretch the square to be a rectangle of any size. And the nice thing about that is we know exactly how many vertices every thing is going to have. Every sprite is going to have 6 vertices. I'm using a 6 vertex format right now. So picture a triangle. It has 3 points, obviously. If we have 2 triangles, we have 6 points because there's 3 points in each. But one thing that I want to do, which was it turned out to be a little bit more complicated than I thought, was get that 6 vertex format down to a 4 vertex format instead. Because like I said, we're rendering rectangles, right? So we should be able to trim it to just 4 points instead. That would be a big optimization win that's not there. And that's probably the biggest one that's not there right now. I think OpenGL, I haven't done a lot of research on that, but I think OpenGL used to have a thing called a quad, which has been deprecated. It sounds like the quad would have been useful for 2D engines, but I think it's been deprecated, so I haven't used that. And I'll see about, I think there's a way to do it as an array, drawing an array of stuff. I don't know. I just have to find out the right magic words to type into OpenGL to get it to accept 4 vertices as a rectangle instead of 6. But anyway, everything is represented with just rectangles, and that simplifies things a lot, probably even more than just, the regular kind of complication that an extra dimension adds or subtracts, Anyway, I think that covers the rendering, or at least gives you a rundown on how the rendering is. I think it's working pretty well right now. There's more that can be done with it. I'll talk maybe more about some other kind of more niche optimization things that I could be doing. I'll do that later. Another thing, the next feature that's in is shaders. As you can see, if I press the button, we can get different shaders up on screen. I don't have anything too complicated right now because I just wanted to make sure that the feature was working and then move on to the next thing. So we just have this monochrome one and a regular one. I don't really have anything to add. The shaders are actually written in the exact same language that they're written in for GameMaker, GLSL. So they come across very easily. But the one thing I would add is this is something that I probably should have already understood, but I kind of overlooked. I could have figured this out, but it became immediately obvious when I started trying to do this, which is that shaders are actually the first thing you implement in order to get something that resembles a game. Of course, you can get stuff drawing to the screen without using a shader, but the important step that a shader does, even when it's doing quote unquote nothing, right? The important thing that it does is it translates your coordinates, your game coordinates, onto screen coordinates, because OpenGL has its own kind of coordinate system where it's -1 on the left and +1 on the right of the screen, right? But we don't want to represent things in games, with just those numbers, anything in that range. We want to use numbers that are more natural to us. And so we need to use a matrix transformation in order to change all of those numbers into the ones that OpenGL expects. So even though you're seeing nothing on screen right now, nothing different than usual in terms of color or anything like that, there is a shader being applied. It's just the pass-through shader, and the pass-through shader does that matrix manipulation and nothing else, right? But basically, unless you're going for a very special effect, basically every shader will have that matrix built into it, as a thing that it does, right? So really, a shader is one of the first things you get up and running, which is kind of interesting because, maybe you think of them as a more complicated effect. These ones are not really. This just changes the colors a little bit, and this is monochrome. But some of the stuff I showed off in the previous videos, they're kind of a more complicated effect. But actually, technically, it's the first thing that you would do, which is kind of interesting. Of course, we have tile maps here as well. This is also read in from a file. It's just a file of comma separated values with a number for each tile, representing each tile. There's not much to say there, except that there is an optimization trick that I could be doing on tile maps. I'll talk about that later. But yeah, they're read in and loaded in the way they should be, so that we could, in theory, we could have more. Right now I can't, but in theory we can have a bunch of other tile maps. Maybe I'll elaborate on them a bit more in a while. But also we have collision. As you can see, all the fleas are moving around the way you would expect. And this is just a port of all of the collision code that I wrote before, all the stuff I showed off in the previous videos. This is a point where it's good to say that I don't know how much GameMaker can actually do for me. I use it, and I certainly use its features and stuff wherever it's obvious to do so. But a lot of the time, when it comes time to implement a new feature, I just sit down and write it myself. I do know that GameMaker has some kind of physics thing that you can use. I don't know how much that handles collisions for you or what the story is with that. Certainly, there's some functions in there that do useful collision stuff already, like test if one object is overlapping with another object and so on and so forth. But for the most part, I wrote all of the collision code that I've been using myself, and the same is true for stuff like the animations and the state machine, and that's why all of this stuff has come across pretty easily, because I wrote it and I understand how it works. And maybe I should have let GameMaker do more of the work there for me, but what can I say? I don't read the fucking manual. I just type stuff and get going on whatever it is I want to make, which is maybe the slower way to do things, but what can I say? I don't like reading manuals and instructions and all that kind of stuff, right? So yeah, a lot of this stuff came across pretty easily. Of course, it takes some effort to change the syntax from GML to C++, and there's little bits here and there that have to be changed because they were relying on the way that GameMaker is object orientated, and this stuff isn't. I don't know if you would call that a feature, but it kind of feels like a feature to me. It's like a quality of life feature for me working on it. None of this is object orientated. I don't really think too hard about the paradigm that I'm using, but I think if you had to classify it, it's probably a functional paradigm. But I don't know how people decide what that is, whether you have to have pure functions or not. It's not pure functions. It's kind of just using functions where they're appropriate and keeping things in a kind of linear execution order that hopefully resembles the assembly code that it will actually turn into, which is why I want to write it that way and not in an object oriented way. So anyway, it's a nice kind of back end feature for me, that it's not object orientated. But yeah, as you can see, the collisions, I won't dwell on them because I've done whole videos on them, right? The collisions, the animations, the state machine, all that stuff is there. It might not look like it because first of all, the fleas are not animating as fluidly as they were in previous videos, if you were to compare. And they're also not doing very much, right? They're just jumping. But that's because I do have curves in, right? I had to figure out how to evaluate Bezier curves, so like I said, I write as much as I can myself, or I write whatever it seems obvious to write myself. But GameMaker has useful features, and if something sticks out to me, I use it, right? And as I talked in prior videos, one of the things that I've really enjoyed about it is using the curves for a variety of different things. But of course, when you're writing your own stuff, you don't have anything with curves. You don't have a curve to evaluate. You don't have a function that evaluates curves, so I had to do that. I'm using a Bezier curve evaluation method, which is pretty well known, and that requires 6 lerps, linear interpolations, in order to get a curved interpolation. So you can think of it as being 6 times heavier than a linear interpolation. But I know exactly what it's doing and exactly how much it costs and all that kind of stuff. But for now, there's only a couple of curves, right? So even though I've brought the curve functionality over and got that up and running, I built up a nice library of generic curve shapes in GameMaker using the editor in GameMaker. It's not easy to port those over into my thing. I think I'm using a different evaluation method and a different way of representing the curves. Theirs is probably better than mine. But they don't come across easily. So really all I have right now is just a linear curve, right, which is not really a curve at all. It's just a straight line and a wave that goes up and down. So that's why I've included those orbs up in the top right corner, just to show a wave curve being utilized. But for animation, I don't really have a lot to play with there, right? In the action editor video, I'm sure I showed off a few different curves when I was editing stuff. All I have right now is just linear interpolation basically on them. And that's why they're not animating as smoothly as they could. They're also not doing very much because I just haven't brought those states over. If you remember before, I talked about how the state machine is very data driven, right? So I consider the individual states themselves to be data, even though technically they are hard coded right now. As I talked with a couple of commenters before about how that should be pushed out to a file. People were encouraging me to do that. And I know I should, and hopefully I'll get around to that at some point. But it is essentially data, right? Even though it's written into the code, you can kind of think of it as scripting or data. If I hit a wall, do I bounce off it? Yes or no? What impulse am I going to take on this frame and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I haven't bothered to make them do anything else, right? Because right now, building up all of the functionality of this engine, I just need to verify that the state machine works. And if all of the code is there that was there before, it all works, right? So if you picture any of the stuff that I showed off before, like when I was messing around with the action editor, or when earlier on when we had Victor sliding and uppercutting around the place, all of that stuff is there, and it's just not being shown right now, right? But the functionality is there. The functionality for animation, state machine collision, all that stuff is there. Another thing is technically everything here is on a layer, so we're not really showing any layered graphics right now. But technically everything here is represented as a layer, which hopefully will make it easy to add more layers later. Now, as I said earlier, you want to minimize the amount of time that you're changing what the GPU is doing. And one important, maybe there's depth testing ways of doing this that, are designed for this kind of thing, and I'll look into that. But at least right now, I consider the most important thing to be the layer that the sprite is being drawn on, right? So obviously we want to draw stuff at the back first so that it's occluded by stuff in the front and not vice versa, right? That's the most important thing. And then we want to do it by texture, and then maybe we want to do it by shader. So there's those kinds of three ways that you have to batch things together. You can't use multiple shaders in a single draw call, at least I don't think so. So that's the way, I might make some improvements to the way that's stored. I do have some concerns about the way that I'm storing these things behind the scenes, with the layers and the actors on the layers and stuff like that. I'm a little bit worried that the memory management, it might cause a hitch in terms, like probably not even a perceptible hitch because we're just making a 2D game, but at least behind the scenes, it might cause a big update if because we're using vectors and stuff. This is hard to explain, but we're using different kinds of boxes that sometimes we need to resize the box and move everything over into a new box. And if that happens and the box is very big, it's going to just be this big bulk operation that has to happen all at once. I'm a little bit concerned that maybe I haven't been too smart about that. But what can I say? It's just something that I have to get to grips with in C++, compared to the stuff I've been using already, GML. So it looks all right so far, and we technically have layers even though we're not using them. All right. Let's talk about some of the stuff that's missing. What's missing right now is particles. There's no particles whatsoever. This is because I think the way that I want to do this is something that I've never tried before, or at least I want to research and maybe try this using a geometry shader. It's a type of shader that I've never written before. And I think if I do it that way, it will allow me to minimize the how much we're asking of the GPU, or at least the communication to the GPU. So I believe if I use a geometry shader, I can send just a point which represents the particle, and then it can be kind of expanded into a rectangle as needed, which obviously would speed them up a lot, which is important. Again, you don't want to get too hung up on optimization, but for particles, I think it's important to at least consider it, considering the whole point of a particle system is to be able to have a lot of them on screen at once, right? So I haven't looked into that yet. I haven't done that yet. They haven't been a priority yet. Maybe I'll tackle them soon. It would be a nice thing to get in, obviously. There's also no bounding boxes, which might be confusing. So you can see all of the fleas are jumping around and they're colliding the way you would expect with the terrain, right? Although there is some points where it's a little bit generous. For example, when they jump up onto a ledge, they really can get up onto that ledge even if they're only 1 pixel onto it, right? And that's a situation where we might want to trim their bounding box in a little bit so that they actually fall, right? They don't actually grip onto the ledge with just 1 pixel of leg. Maybe we actually want them to fall there, right? So the bounding box is just a separate rectangle. It's a piece of information that lets us know where does this thing collide. At the moment, the sprites, the fleas, they're working and looking like they collide correctly because their sprite is clamped very tightly to what you're seeing on screen. There's not a lot of empty space around them, and they're a pretty homogeneous shape between each frame, right? They don't contort very much. But if you think of other things like Victor, when I went to do a slide, his body shape changed a lot as he was doing that. And, we can compensate for this by making them different states and stuff like that. But as far as I'm aware, and again, I don't read the manual, so maybe I just don't know how to do this. But as far as I'm aware, in Game Maker, every animation is its own sprite. And it just assigns 1 bounding box per sprite, right? Per animation. So if you have an animation where the character changes a lot, you can kind of find yourself in a situation where when you're trying to set up the bounding box, you're thinking to yourself, well, on this frame it's a little bit over and on this frame it's a little bit under. You're trying to find the thing that kind of works best for all frames. But if you were to look at any individual frame of animation, you're compromising a little bit, right? It's not quite as tight as it could be. It's not really covering his head, or it's not really covering his feet here, And games do this stuff all the time, by the way. The bounding box very rarely is exact to the sprite. But this is potentially a gain that could be made if I were to implement this in this engine, have a separate bounding box for every sprite, because one thing I would like to do is just have one for every frame of animation, if possible. As I showed in a previous video, the collision system already accounts for that. It has a pretty good way of pushing you out of stuff in the right way. I think at least it seems to work to me anyway. If your bounding box changes shape, as I showed off before. So of course that comes with a slight performance hit, but generally I've prioritized robustness over efficiency with the collision system that I made, which is not to say that it's inefficient exactly, but I think it's robust, and it would be nice to kind of capitalize on that robustness by allowing different bounding boxes for each frame of animation, So as far as I'm aware, it's not something that can be done in Game Maker, but the reason I haven't done it here myself is I'm just not sure how I want to represent it. How do I want to represent these bounding boxes? I have no editors at all, right? So this is the nice thing about Game Makers, is loads of built-in editors. And, when you want to figure out what the bounding box is on a certain sprite, you just pull up the sprite and the bounding box is there overlapping it, and you can tweak it whatever way you want, So there's a lot of stuff that Game Maker does that's still not implemented here, especially if we consider the lack of editors, right? There's no level editor. This level was set up by just typing in a text file, right? Things like that. But yeah, maybe there's a chance to put in a nice bounding box system that allows us to do a different one on each frame. It's just a question of how do we get that data into the game, right? Do I have to type that in manually? That seems like it's going to be horrible. Do I need to go and make an editor of my own? Or, one idea that I'm thinking of doing is, what if I just take all of the sprites and kind of draw a rectangle, and then, I interpret the image, the rectangle in the image, as a bounding box. Probably kind of expensive at runtime, but maybe easy to edit, There's all kinds of trade-offs to make there, and I'm not entirely sure what way I want to go about that. There's also no sound at the moment, but I haven't even got around to sound in GameMaker either. Obviously, it would be much harder to do sound here. I'm hoping that sound would be useful, or sorry, SDL would be useful there again to get sound, and maybe also to do post-processing shaders. As I showed, there is shaders, but there's no post-processing shaders at the moment. I have a suspicion that would be fairly easy to do, especially since it seems like maybe SDL is some help there. I think it can help me copy a surface and, stuff like that. But there's technically no post-processing shaders at the moment, which means that there is certain things you can't do. Certain things you can only really do in a post-processing shader, like any type of blurring. You need to make sure that you have the pixels. If you're trying to blur a flea, you need to know that underneath him is orange, right? So you have to kind of have the final scene all ready to go. That's why it has to be a post-processing shader, so that you can blur those two values together appropriately, rather than, if you try to blur each individual sprite, it's just not going to look right at all. So there's technically no post-processing shaders. There's no way of, right now I have, and this is a big omission, but right now I have no way of deleting any of my actors, right? So I call these things actors, the flea and the orbs and anything else that kind of moves around and collides and does stuff, uses the state machine. There's no way of deleting them. Now I did have that working at one point, but I went and did a rewrite of how the vertex information is stored to get it tightly packed, and I haven't gone back and fixed it since then. But it's funny sometimes, the things that can be surprisingly difficult. I haven't gone back and done it again, and maybe it's not going to be that difficult. It actually wasn't difficult to set up the first time. What I'm saying here, though, is it's the kind of thing you have to be careful about, because if you do it wrong, you're going to end up with a memory leak, right? So it's the kind of thing I have to be careful about, because the sprite is kind of separated from his vertex information. When we say we kill off some of these fleas, they no longer exist. Therefore, we no longer want to draw them. Therefore, we have to get rid of their vertex information, so we're no longer drawing them. But those two pieces of information are not quite stored together, so we need to make sure that we access the vertex information. But because the vertex information, there can be more or less vertices at any given time, it has to be stored in a dynamic array, or a vector as it's called in C++, and that can shift around where it is in memory. So yeah, you can end up with memory leaks or seg faults or whatever. It's kind of hard to explain, but yeah, there's technically no way to delete stuff, which means there's technically no way to have multiple levels right now. If we can't get rid of all the stuff we have on screen and make sure it's all gone, we can't really load in another level. But all of the loading stuff is done. We just need to do all of the unloading stuff as well. Right now, there's also no semi-solids. Should be pretty easy to add them later. I wrote down that there's no camera, which is not really true. There is a camera, and the camera stuff that I've done so far, even in GameMaker, is pretty straightforward, I think, So I don't think it would be very hard to get that up and running again. But I suppose one thing that I mean when I say there's no camera is that there's no occlusion culling either. That's an optimization technique that's not being used. What that means is, if you picture this screen, imagine this as a level that goes way off screen to the right. Even if there's something way over to the right, way off screen, we're still spending GPU time drawing it, which is obviously not ideal, right? But one reason why I haven't, it's an important optimization thing to do, right? But one reason I haven't done it yet is because it's not actually relevant to every type of game that you could make. I'm trying to focus on stuff that I think is really relevant. But if you were to make a simple, single screen arcade type game like Donkey Kong or something like that, that wouldn't be necessary, because everything's going to be on screen all the time anyway, right? So that's one reason why I haven't prioritized that yet. Also, I just don't really want to do it, because it's probably going to be kind of annoying to get it right, but at least I have an excuse for not having done it yet. So because we can't unload stuff, we don't have level transitions either. And there are other optimization techniques that I should look into. Like, one of the things I'm interested in doing is, if you look at that block up at the top left, the 7x7 block, if you could see the wireframe information for that, that's actually I don't know, hundreds of triangles. It's like 100 triangles basically, right? So the GPU is having to draw 100 triangles when really what we could do if we were smart about how we process the level is we could say, well, all of these tiles are of the exact same type. They're all going to have the same texture on them and so on. And it's just a big square. And I can make squares with 4 points, right? So what we're going to do is we're just going to combine them all into 2 big triangles instead and draw them as one big square. And then just have a repeating texture over it, right? I think that's possible. And it would save a lot of effort on the GPU's behalf. But I do think that doing that would be the efficiency gain would not be as large as it seems from what you're seeing on screen. Because what you're looking at right now is the collider stuff that's not going to be drawn anyway, right? If we had actual ground textures, ground tiles, we probably wouldn't want to have a single ground tile that repeats 1,000 times. We're going to want at least a few variants of it so that we can mix and match them, and the ground won't look as repetitive. In which case we can't really bundle them all together that way, right? And another problem is if we have tiles that animate. So if you picture something like Axiom Verge, where there are parts of the terrain that pulse with the music or whatever, we also need to be able to update the animation, the texture info for that whenever it changes, right? Whenever it's animating. So that also can't be combined with other tiles. So I do think that this is the kind of optimization that, real engines are looking at and doing probably, but that it's probably not as big a gain as it sounds like on paper. And so therefore I haven't prioritized it yet. There's also, I'm just not entirely sure what approach I would use to do that. This is the kind of thing where it probably gets into really maths heavy kind of approaches that I'm not fond of working on myself, because you might have different batches of tiles that could kind of be grouped together, and you might have to decide which one minimizes the number of vertices, right? You might have multiple different configurations which are all valid. Like the thing that we were doing here with the 7x7 block, that's the only possible configuration that makes sense. But if you look at the platform next to it, where we have kind of 3 steps, well, what's the best way to do that? I'm not entirely sure, right? Maybe it doesn't really matter, because we can probably just break it into 3 squares either way, but do we do them lengthwise, or do we do them more by the step that they are, right? And of course that just gets more complicated the more complicated the shape is. So there's probably all kinds of techniques for that, but that's not the kind of work I enjoy. But yeah, I think it's probably not as important as it might seem when you're just looking at these orange tiles that all look the same, I think that's a pretty good overview of the kind of features that are present and not present. I definitely would like to work on this more and, get particles in and really get it to the point where it looks exactly like the stuff I've been showing before. Hopefully when you clicked on the video, you didn't know that it was my own engine instead of GameMaker, which is pretty cool, right? But I would immediately pick up on the fact that the fleas are not animating as smoothly as I'm used to, and also that they're not doing very much, right? So there's at least one immediately obvious difference to me, which is that the fleas are not animating as smoothly as they were before. And of course we don't have particles, so if we were using particles anywhere, we can't do that. And right, I went over it all, what's missing, right? So I definitely like to work on this more, but if you got to this point in the video and you're not sure whether this is a big deal or not, or what I'm even talking about, then this might be a disappointment to have saved this for about half an hour in or so. But I don't know if this is actually worth using instead of GameMaker. It's definitely a cool project to have embarked upon, and I'm glad I did it. But there are serious downsides to using your own engine that GameMaker and other engines like Unity and stuff like that, they alleviate. I think the biggest one, and again, this is an area I haven't done as much research as I should, so I don't even know all the pros and cons, right? But the biggest one, in my mind at least, or at least that I'm aware of, is the ability to export to consoles. As far as I'm aware, if you're going to release a Switch or a PlayStation or an Xbox version of a game, Xbox might be different because, well, Xbox is a special case because they probably use DirectX, and they might use a very vanilla normal version of DirectX which you can just port over by itself. But also that is a problem because I'm using OpenGL here, right? So I would have to swap out all of the graphics, like I would have to have a different version for the Xbox that we can flip between, where all of the OpenGL function calls are swapped out for DirectX calls, which are hopefully functionally identical, but which probably have some minor differences that need to be accounted for and blah, 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 right? So that's its own problem. Unless maybe the Xbox supports OpenGL. I'm not sure. Maybe it does. But, the Switch and the PlayStation probably have slightly customized versions, and you basically have to get an SDK from them in order to do that, to my knowledge anyway. And we would not be able to get one. We don't have an office. Of course, the scenario I'm talking about is, releasing on PC first and actually having a successful game, which is obviously not a given. But even in that case, we might not get an SDK, even if we asked for one, right? Because it's a sensitive thing, and maybe they just wouldn't give it to us. So we might have to go through a publisher in order to release a console version, which is a big downside. Now, I reckon I haven't actually exported a different version from GameMaker, and I reckon when you do that, there probably is a few bugs that rear their heads, a few things that pop up that you have to kind of knock down, and, obviously you have to do things like make sure all the button prompts are right for the console version and all that kind of stuff. But it should, in theory, allow you to just, have a Switch version there once the game is ready, right? Have a PlayStation version and all that. They're all there once the game is ready, in theory anyway. That's a big downside. The counterpoint to that is, well, what if GameMaker goes away, right? What if they shut their doors tomorrow? I don't think that's going to happen. Not tomorrow. But, who can say what the landscape is going to be in 20 years, right? If you make your game and it's just in GameMaker, 20 years later, maybe there's a console and there's a different graphics library that it uses for whatever reason, right? I don't know, it's optimized for battery power for something, and they decided to use their own, Apple have come out with a console and it has its own graphics API, because of course it does. And you want to release on it because it's the most popular console of its day. And, GameMaker doesn't exist anymore. Well, then you have to make your own engine anyway, or you have to port it to another engine anyway, right? Because you can't export from you can't export from an engine which is no longer being updated, right? So that's a big downside, but it's a kind of theoretical downside, which is probably far off in the future. It doesn't seem like GameMaker is going anywhere anytime soon, but who knows? I'm sure there's more pros and cons, but those are the two big ones. I do think, if I could be optimistic, I would say that I think, obviously this thing is nowhere near ready right now, but I do think that I probably could get it to the point where I could release a PC game, right? Every PC graphics card has OpenGL in it. They both, at least again to my knowledge, they both support, they support both DirectX and OpenGL. That's just a thing that's, been the case for many years now, right? These have been the two graphics libraries that are supported by every graphics card. So it shouldn't really be a problem. We're probably not doing anything fancy that requires you to have the absolute latest version of OpenGL. And so it can probably just release on PC just fine. So even to get something to that point would be nice, I think. You can decide for yourself whether this was a waste of time or not. I don't know. What I can say is I learned a lot doing it. I definitely know more about how games are rendered and structured than I ever have, which might prove useful, even just going back to GameMaker. Maybe there's certain things I could be doing better there now that I know how, stuff is probably optimized behind the scenes. But I don't know, this is kind of a stupid thing to say and a stupid thing to think, but I'm the kind of person, as you have probably gathered, I'm the kind of person who likes to do things from first principles. And this is not from first principles. It's using SDL, which is doing some really unenjoyable stuff for me. But, it's using OpenGL the way a real engine does. And I didn't know if that was something that I could do. And I'm happy to have done it. And I think, up until now, I didn't really consider myself to be a games programmer, partly because we haven't actually released a game yet, but also because I just didn't know if I could actually, program a full game by myself. And I think this has gotten to the point now where I can say that I probably could, right? And maybe it would be really buggy. Maybe we would have a lot of problems on release day, but, maybe I can hammer that down and actually use my own engine if needs be, right? If push comes to shove, or if this... if this carries on, if I carry on with this and it goes well, maybe that's something I can do. It was satisfying, and I feel like I'm more ready than ever to make a game as a result, because I feel like I actually can do it. I'm not just I don't know. I feel like I can do it, and I think that that's been useful, even if nothing else comes of this. So, um, but in theory, this is not actually useful work, you know. I suppose I'll close out by saying, for anybody who missed the Patreon, uh, we mentioned that we've paused Mushido for the time being because we're pursuing one of the prototypes that I made, which seems promising. I'm still not ready to say that it's the thing that we're making instead of Mushido, and I want to emphasize that Mushido is just paused, and we're both looking forward to going back to it. I was actually really enjoying the enemy design work that we were doing. It was going better than I thought it would, and I was really enjoying that. So I am looking forward to going back to it. But obviously, I want to get a game made, and this thing is smaller and should hopefully be easier to create. So that's what we're pursuing instead. I don't know if we'll actually continue with it, but hopefully, in the next few months, we can have something that is worth showing to you. So we're going to carry on with that for now. And there has been work on that, but this has taken up most of my February and a good bit of my January as well. So I don't know. I'll leave it to you to decide whether it was a worthwhile use of time. I'm happy with it. I enjoyed working on it, and to be honest, I want to continue on with it, but I will get back to working on that prototype and doing the kind of stuff that I should be doing. And yeah, maybe we can't release a game with this, but hopefully this was at least interesting, and I'll keep chipping away at this as I go and see what becomes of it. Let me know what you think anyway. And I'll leave it there for now. Thanks for tuning in. I hope it was interesting. Maybe some of the rendering stuff was interesting. I don't know. If nothing else comes of it, I hope this was at least interesting. And that'll do for today. Thanks for watching, everybody.